Hi guys, my name is Mr. Lead, and today we're going to be talking about ecosystems. More specifically, we're talking about the relationships we see in ecosystems. Now, in the last lesson, we talked about the differences between certain terminologies we use in ecology, such as the difference between a habitat and an environment and an ecosystem. A habitat refers to specifically just the place where an organism lives. For example, the habitat of a green tree frog is a rainforest. That's the type of habitat it lives in. An environment refers to the surroundings that affect that organism. For example, the environment of a green tree frog is not a rainforest. The environment is moist, it's dark and shady, that sort of thing. An ecosystem, on the other hand, is a much more broader and encompassing term. We're not just talking, when we talk about ecosystems, we don't use the term ecosystem in reference to just one organism or one species, because an ecosystem talks about an entire community of living organisms, plus the non-living components and the interactions between them. So the biotic factors, abiotic factors, and the interactions between them in a given area. You need to include those three things in your definition of what an ecosystem is. So with ecosystems, we see a lot of interactions, like I said, between all these different components. And that means that all these different components are very interdependent on each other. We see plants and animals that are continually dependent on each other because they're providing oxygen and carbon dioxide to each other. We see plants and animals providing food for each other. We see plants and animals needing each other to reproduce, and we see plants and animals that help provide nutrients for each other to be recycled throughout the ecosystem. If you take out certain animals, the plants that depend on those animals will probably die away because of this great interdependence we see in ecosystems. Now, energy and nutrients are really core themes and core components of ecosystems. We see energy being transferred through an ecosystem. Some organisms get their energy from, say, the sun, some get it from consuming others, and some get it by breaking down dead matter. That's different to consuming others, by the way. But yeah, when it comes to energy, an ecosystem needs to get its energy from a place to begin with. Say you have a group of organisms all together, and those organisms are all feeding off each other, but that energy has to start from somewhere in the first place. And where does it start? It starts from the sun. So we can represent the flow of energy with food webs and food chains. So here in a food web, you see the sun here is providing energy to these producers, which are then providing energy to these consumers, and they provide energy further on. This energy gets passed along and starts with the sun. If you don't have the sun, or if you don't have some sort of initial source of energy, you're not going to see these higher order as species getting that energy. Now, food webs and food chains, you really need to be familiar with these and know how to draw them. The key things to note: a food chain is just one sequence of organisms, one chain, okay, one line. You usually don't show the sun or decomposes in a food chain, but in a food web, you're showing all the populations in a given community, and you're showing how they normally interact with each other, or more specifically, which ones consume what. The arrows on a food chain need to go from the first organism to the second. They need to point this way because the arrows specifically represent the transfer of energy. Okay. And the other things you need to note with food chains is the types of diets and trophic levels. Types of diets, what are they? They are literally just what an organism eats. So plants, for example, their diet is, they are autotrophs. Then you can have diets such as herbivorous diets, so herbivores. Then you've got carnivores and omnivores as well. So plant eaters, meat eaters, and organisms that eat a bit of both, like us. By the way, these types of diets is what I summarize what an organism eats on the majority. For example, if you see a cat eating grass because it's sick, and cats do that, by the way, you don't call a cat an omnivore because that's just a one-off occasion you see that organism eat plants. If they predominantly eat meat, they'll be a carnivore. And then you've also got detritivores and decomposers. These guys are different to everyone else because they break down dead matter. What a trophic level is, trophic levels refer to where an organism is positioned in a food chain or food web. So types of diets, that's what an organism eats. and trophic levels where they are positioned in a food chain or food web. People get those two mixed up all the time. So you can have producers. Producers are at the start of the food chain or food web. And so there will always be autotrophs. Then you've got consumers. You've got a whole line of consumers, primary, secondaries, and tertiaries. And then you've got decomposers and detritivores, which sit off to the side. When it comes to producers, we've got to remember that they have to get their energy from the sun, and they use photosynthesis to do that. Sometimes algae and bacteria producers, but all ecosystems must at least have one producer in it to give that initial source of energy to the system. If you don't have any producers, how is that group of organisms going to get its initial source of energy? So photosynthesis can be summarized with this chemical equation. This is the process and this is the process they plan to use to photosynthesize. They take carbon dioxide and water, and they use the sun's energy to convert this stuff into sugar and oxygen. Don't worry about like what all these letters and everything means. As long as you know carbon dioxide plus water gives you sugar and oxygen, that's what photosynthesis is. Now, decomposers and detritivores. These guys, like I said before, they break down dead animals and plants and leave behind nutrients for producers to feed on. So we talked before how two core things that are in an ecosystem is energy and nutrients. Decomposers are really key to an ecosystem because they help cycle nutrients through an ecosystem. The difference between dirt and soil is just dirt with nutrients in it. You don't get that nutrients in the first place unless a decomposer or a detritivore has broken down some dead matter to leave behind nutrients for producers to feed on. So a plant will not be able to grow in soil that's nutrient deficient, but a plant that has found soil that lots of decomposers have been through and left behind nutrients in will be able to grow very well. The difference between these two, a detritivore is just an animal that feeds on detritus, that's dead particles and dead organic matter, and they have to digest this internally, okay? Us humans, we digest food internally. We put food into our mouths and we let it digest, say, in our stomachs and everything. Decomposers, on the other hand, they digest externally. They have to release enzymes outside their body. It's kind of like they're puking up. They're not actually puking, and we don't see any of this puke because it's on the microscopic level, but they release these enzymes externally and let their food digest externally before they absorb the nutrients in. All right? So that's the difference between these two. Examples include, say, snails, millipedes, crabs for detritivores. Decomposers can include bacteria, mushrooms, and mold. Worms are another type of detritivores. Now, in terms of difference between these two, sometimes you might hear some scientists say that worms are, say, a type of decomposer. And technically that's true, depending on what type of terminology you subscribe to. So this is kind of a side note. Some scientists will say that detritivores and decomposers are two totally separate groups of organisms, while some scientists will say that detritivores are a type of decomposer, and the other type are called saprophytes. Either way, whatever type of terminology you subscribe to, you just need to know that there are these two groups of organisms that break down dead organic matter and leave behind nutrients. All right, so that is a summary of what we see in food webs and food chains. Now we're going to talk about the different relationships that we often see between different organisms. So we can summarize some relationships to be in three different categories. We can see organisms showing a predation relationship or a symbiotic relationship, or showing competition. So this is better illustrated like this. Competition, that is when you have two organisms that are competing for the same resource. This resource could be food, or it could be mating, or it could be shelter. So in an example here, we see lions and hyenas are both competing for this dead food here. So in this situation, you see a lose-lose situation, though usually you'd see one organism losing less than the other, but both of them are hurt in this case. In predation, we see one organism feeding upon the other. This is not two organisms competing. This is one is just feeding on the other. So one species is happy, but the other one is at a disadvantage. Mutualism, on the other hand, now we've come into these three types of symbiosis. Symbiosis is just when you have two organisms that are living in close physical association with each other. So with these two, they're not really necessarily in close physical association, but in these three, they are. And I'm talking so close that one is like on top of the other. With mutualism, you see both species benefiting. For example, we see oxpeckers. You might have seen oxpeckers on the backs of hippos, and hippos like the oxpeckers to be there because they feed on their parasites, and the oxpeckers like to be there because they get food. Parasitism, that is when you have one benefiting and the other is being harmed. So, for example, in this case, the fleas are the parasites. So a parasite can live on or inside you, doesn't have to be only inside. Fleas are the ones that are benefiting, but the dog is harmed. And commensalism is when one species is benefited and the other one doesn't, it's not affected. It doesn't mind. Say just barnacles living on a whale, the whale doesn't mind if the barnacles live there. So let's go through a few examples. What type of relationship is this? We got a clownfish that is being protected by an enemy's tentacles, and the enemy gets its waste removed by the clownfish. Well, that's mutualism. We're seeing both species benefiting. What type of relationship is this? Two deers are fighting over who gets to mate with a female, where they're both competing for a resource, so that's competition. What about this? We got weeds that are growing in the same area as a garden bed. Well, this is also competition because we're seeing them both competing for space. Here we're seeing intraspecific competition between the same species. Here this is competition between different species, interspecific competition. What about a frog that is just living and camouflaged on the plant, but the plant is unaffected? That's commensalism. So yeah, if an organism lives in a tree, boom, that's commensalism because the tree doesn't care if an organism lives there or not, or usually doesn't. And what if wasp larva is growing inside a caterpillar? That's parasitism. And last one, a northern Pacific sea star feeding upon a crab. That would be predation. All right. So we've now covered the different types of interactions. We're going back to this idea of food webs and coming back to the idea of interdependence. We see that all of these species are actually really dependent on each other, whether you realize it or not. Ecosystems are really fragile things. Ecosystems rely on this perfect balance between all these different animals. You need the right amount of prawns to be there so that the right amount of algae gets eaten and the right amount of trout gets eaten. And if you've got the right amount of every type of animal and the right amount of resources, then you're not going to see any changes in that ecosystem. That's good. But if you introduce a new species into an ecosystem, you'll see that just muck up the entire ecosystem. For example, in this case, we see rabbits being introduced to an area, and that just completely changes what the area looks like. The rabbits have just eaten so much, and then all the things that the rabbits eaten affect everything else. So look, in this case, if we take away one species in an ecosystem, say for example, we take away the dragonflies, that affects the rest of the ecosystem. It affects the rest, and we can see the food web to help show this. So if we take away the dragonfly, there'll be less frogs because there's not enough food for the frogs, but there'll be more flies because the dragonflies were originally eating the flies. Now there's more turtles because the turtles will eat the flies, but there'll be less snakes because there's less frogs for the snakes to eat. The kingfisher will be all right, but there's less trout because the kingfisher will now have to feed on the trout instead of the frogs. There'll be less of these guys. And there'll be more algae. You kind of get the picture. There's going to be an entirely massive change. Way an ecosystem can survive, even when a change happens, say you introduce a new species or you take out a species, the way an ecosystem can best survive if it's more biodiverse. That means if there is a more diversity, or that is, there is more types of organisms and more species in an ecosystem, then you won't see as much interdependence because one organism will only be dependent on a few neighboring organisms. Okay, so if this food web was way bigger and we took out one species, that's not going to affect that's not going to be a big enough change to affect the entire food web. So the more biodiverse an ecosystem is, the more types of organisms that are in there, the less susceptible it is to change. That's why we want ecosystems with as much animals as we can. And that's why it's a good thing not to harm our ecosystems. Thanks for watching.